The bells of Storm's End tolled across the castle, their deep echoes swallowed by the roar of the sea. The banners of House Baratheon and House Stark hung side by side in the great hall, an uneasy union sealed by duty rather than love. Robert Baratheon stood tall and proud in his black and gold tunic, the crowned stag emblazoned on his chest. At his side, Lyanna Stark, draped in a gown of icy blue, looked every bit the northern princess, wild, unyielding, and impossibly distant. Robert had won his prize, but even as he grasped her hand before the septon, he could feel the coldness in her fingers. The union was celebrated across the realm, a match of power and prestige, uniting the storm and the ice. But those closest to Lyanna knew her heart did not beat for Robert. Even now she thought of another, of violet eyes that had once locked with hers in quiet promises beneath the godswood. The feast was grand, the tables overflowing with roasted boar, honeyed bread and spiced wine. Lords and ladies laughed and cheered, raising their cups to the new Queen of Storm's End, but Lyanna barely ate, barely smiled. She sat beside Robert as he bellowed and drank, boasting of future sons who would be strong as lions and fast as wolves. She clenched her goblet, thinking of the life she had never chosen, the love she had been forced to abandon. After the wedding, they rode south to King's Landing. The small folk cheered for their new queen, though they knew little of her sorrow. Robert was oblivious, or perhaps he willed himself to ignore it. He loved Lyanna, loved the idea of her at least. He had built her into a legend in his mind, a perfect maiden stolen from him by Rhaegar Targaryen. But Lyanna was no legend. She was flesh and blood, with a heart too restless to be caged. The Red Keep became her prison. She had lived wild in the north, riding through the wolfswood, her hair loose in the wind. Now she was expected to sit quietly, to wear silk instead of furs, to nod and smile as courtiers whispered and watched. Robert spent his days hunting and drinking, leaving her alone to navigate a court she despised. Cersei Lannister, the daughter of Tywin, watched from the shadows, her green eyes sharp with jealousy. She had once been promised to Robert, and she resented the northern girl who had taken her place. Days turned to weeks, and still Lyanna did not soften toward Robert. He grew frustrated, his temper short, his patience thinner than the ice of the north. "Why do you not love me?" he asked one night, voice thick with wine. "I would give you anything." She turned from him, her face hidden in the moonlight. "You cannot give me what I have already lost." His hands curled into fists, but he said nothing. He knew what she meant. He had won the battle, but not the war. He had Lyanna, but he did not have her heart. And so the storm raged on. The days passed in King's Landing, but for Lyanna, time felt frozen. She was a queen in name only, a figure to be paraded around court while her husband drank himself into a stupor, blinded by his love for a woman who no longer existed. Robert Baratheon had spent years idealizing her, turning her into a dream rather than a person. But now that she stood beside him, alive and real, he did not know what to do with her unwilling heart. Lyanna spent her days wandering the Red Keep, finding solace only in the godswood, though even that felt foreign in this southern heat. She longed for Winterfell, for the cold bite of the northern air, for the freedom of the open woods. Here she was a caged wolf, surrounded by lions who waited for her to stumble. Cersei Lannister, golden and cold, watched her with barely concealed disdain. She had been meant to marry Robert, to be his queen, but Lyanna had taken her place. And Robert, foolish, lovesick Robert, could not see the venom in Cersei's smile, the daggers hidden in her words. "You do not seem to enjoy court life, Your Grace," Cersei said one afternoon, as they sat beneath the shade of the royal gardens. "I do not see the point of it," Lyanna answered bluntly. "It is nothing but whispers and empty flattery." Cersei smirked, sipping her wine. "And yet, Whispers rule kingdoms more often than swords do. Lyanna said nothing, but she felt the truth in those words. She had been raised in the north, where men spoke plainly, where honor was valued above ambition. But here, in the south, honor was a fool's game. Here, power belonged to those who knew how to wield it in the shadows. She should have paid more attention to those whispers, because in the depths of the Red Keep, rumors had begun to spread. Of a queen who did not love her king, of a marriage already crumbling, and of the name that still lingered on Lyanna's lips when she thought no one could hear, Rhaegar. One night, as Robert stumbled into their chambers, reeking of wine and sweat, he caught the slip of her tongue as she mumbled in her sleep. He froze, his drunken haze clearing in an instant. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with rage. Lyanna woke with a start, her heart pounding. "What? You said his name!" She stared at him, realizing too late what she had done. "You dream of him," Robert growled, his fists clenching. "Even now, after everything, after I saved you." "You did not save me," Lyanna whispered. Robert staggered back as if she had struck him. For the first time he saw her as she truly was. Not the girl he had built up in his mind, not the perfect maiden he had loved from afar, but a woman who had never wanted him. His anger burned hot, but beneath it was something else, something worse, hurt. He turned without another word, slamming the door behind him, leaving Lyanna alone with the ghosts of her past. But the echoes of that moment would ripple through the realm, because a king who doubts his queen is a king who begins to listen to whispers. And in a court full of schemers, whispers were deadlier than any sword. The days that followed were thick with silence. Robert did not return to their chambers. He drowned himself in wine and war stories, pretending the wound Lyanna had left in him did not fester. But the truth was, it did. And the court noticed. The queen and the king were at odds. Lyanna, in her loneliness, found solace in the Godswood, the only place in King's Landing that felt remotely familiar. It was there that her brother Eddard Stark found her one evening. "You look tired, sister," Ned said, his voice carrying the weight of worry. Lyanna gave a tired smile. "You sound like father." "He would not approve of this," Ned said carefully. "Of the distance between you and Robert." She laughed bitterly. "Robert and I were a mistake before we even stood before the Septon. You are his queen. I never wanted to be." The words hung between them, raw and heavy. Ned sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "The realm is watching, Lyanna. Robert is not the kind of man who handles humiliation well." She looked away. She knew that. She had seen the anger in his eyes the night he heard her whisper Rhaegar's name, the way his jaw clenched when he looked at her and did not see love reflected back. "Be careful," Ned warned. "There are those who would use this against you." And he was right, because the whispers had already begun. Cersei Lannister was nothing if not patient. She had always known Robert would never love her, but to be set aside for a woman who did not even love him, that was an insult she could not bear. And so she whispered to her father, Tywin Lannister, who had little love for a king that was not his own blood, to Peter Baelish, who thrived on chaos and opportunity, and most importantly, to Varys, the Spider, who knew that a king who doubted his queen was a king who could be guided. "The realm cannot afford a weak king," Cersei murmured to her father one evening, watching as Robert laughed drunkenly in the great hall. "And Robert is weak when it comes to her." Tywin said nothing at first, merely studying his daughter. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Then we shall make him strong." The first move came subtly, a letter, unsigned, but carrying a chilling accusation. "The Queen has been unfaithful." Robert found the letter in his chambers, left on his table alongside his goblet of wine. His hands shook as he read it. He wanted to throw it into the fire, to dismiss it as lies spun by jealous nobles. But the seed had been planted. The doubt had already begun to take root. Did she still love Rhaegar? Had she ever loved him at all? Was she carrying another man's child? The thoughts consumed him, poisoning his mind. He started watching her, more closely, noting the way she spoke with certain lords, the way she withdrew from him, the way she avoided his touch. And then, one night after too much wine, Robert finally snapped. Lyanna had barely laid down when the door to her chambers burst open. Robert stood in the doorway, his face shadowed with anger and something darker, betrayal. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. Lyanna sat up, frowning. "What are you talking about?" He took a step closer, the smell of ale thick on his breath. "Have you taken a lover?" She stared at him in disbelief. "No, lies." His voice cracked. "You never wanted me. You still dream of him. Robert, whose child do you carry?" The word struck her like a slap. She rose to her feet, fury rising in her chest. "You dare accuse me of this? Give me a reason not to," he spat. "Tell me you love me. Tell me you never loved him." Silence, and that silence broke him more than any words ever could. Robert staggered back, his eyes burning with grief and rage. Without another word, he stormed out, leaving Lyanna behind, her hands trembling. She did not know it yet, but that night would change everything, because a king humiliated was a king who sought vengeance, and vengeance in the Red Keep was never clean. The next morning, the air in the Red Keep was thick, with tension. Servants moved quietly, avoiding the king's chambers. Lords and ladies exchanged whispers in the halls. Something had shifted, something dangerous. Lyanna woke to find her door guarded by men she did not recognize. Lannister men. Not the usual Baratheon retainers or even Stark men loyal to her. "Brother." She rose, feeling the weight of unease settle in her bones. She was a prisoner. The realization hit her like a slap. She stormed to the door, her heart pounding. "Step aside," she ordered. The guards did not move. "I am your queen." Still, they remained silent. Lyanna's blood ran cold. This was not Robert's doing, not entirely. He was too reckless, too impulsive. No, this had the careful, calculating touch of Tywin Lannister. She turned on her heel, her mind racing. There was only one person she could trust now. "Ned, something is wrong." Eddard Stark had barely sat down when Lyanna appeared in his chambers, her face pale, her breathing uneven. He rose immediately, alarmed by the urgency in her voice. "What happened?" "I'm being watched. Lannister men guard my doors. I tried to leave this morning and they would not let me." Ned's jaw tightened. "Did Robert order this?" She hesitated. "I don't know. But he doubts me, Ned. He thinks I have betrayed him." Ned swore under his breath. "This is their doing," he said bitterly. "The Lannisters. They want to turn him against you." "What do we do?" Lyanna asked, her voice quieter. Now, for the first time in a long time, she looked uncertain. She had always been fierce, defiant, but now she looked like a woman standing on the edge of something terrible. "We leave," Ned said firmly. "Tonight. I will take you back to Winterfell. Robert has lost himself in his anger, and the Lannisters will use that against you." Lyanna nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. "Then we must be quick." But fate was not so kind. The doors burst open before they could even take a step. Robert Baratheon stood there, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, his storm-blue eyes, were filled with something cold and unrelenting. Behind him stood Tywin Lannister and his son Jaime, their faces carefully impassive. Ned moved instinctively, stepping between his sister and the king. "Robert, think about what you're doing." "I have thought," Robert said, his voice heavy. "I have thought for days." He looked past Ned, his gaze landing on Lyanna. "And I see now what I should have seen long ago." "Robert," Lyanna said softly, trying one last time. "You know me." He flinched. I thought I did. Tywin Lannister stepped forward, his voice smooth as silk. Your Grace, a queen accused of treason cannot be left unchecked. For the good of the realm, an investigation must be conducted. Ned's blood boiled. Treason! What treason? Tywin's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Conspiring against the king, attempting to flee the capital, perhaps even carrying another man's child. Lyanna's breath hitched. You dare! Ned took a step forward, but Jaime Lannister's hand was already on his sword. Robert turned away, as if unable to bear the sight of her any longer. She will remain here, under guard, until the truth is known. And if the truth is that she is innocent? Ned demanded. Robert's jaw clenched. He did not answer, because deep down he had already made his decision. The king turned and walked away. The doors slammed shut. Lyanna Stark was alone, and the game had truly begun. The days that followed were suffocating. Lyanna was confined to her chambers, her every move watched by Lannister guards. Servants avoided her eyes when they brought her food, their hands shaking as if they feared even being near her. The whispers had turned to accusations, and accusations in King's Landing had a way of becoming truth. She knew what they were doing. Robert was not a schemer. He did not think in shadows and whispers. He was a man of war, a man of action. But Tywin Lannister was different. Tywin was patient, methodical. He would not simply remove Lyanna. He would turn Robert against her first, ensuring that when the time came, there would be no one left to speak for her. Except Ned. Ned Stark had not been idle. He had spent his days gathering allies, meeting with those who still held loyalty to House Stark, but King's Landing was a dangerous place, and with every step he took, the noose tightened around him. One evening, as he sat in his chambers, there was a quiet knock on the door. He reached for his sword before opening it. Petyr Baelish stood there, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ned," he said smoothly, "I hear you are looking for friends." Ned narrowed his eyes. "And you are no friend of mine." Baelish laughed softly. "No, but I am a friend of opportunity, and right now an opportunity presents itself. I don't trust you." "You shouldn't," Baelish admitted, "but you are running out of options." Ned hesitated. He knew Littlefinger was dangerous, a man who thrived on chaos. But if there was even a chance that he could help Lyanna... "Speak," Ned said. Baelish stepped closer. "Robert is a fool. He's angry, wounded, but he does not yet see the full picture. If you can remind him of who he is, who Lyanna is, perhaps he will not be so quick to listen to Tywin." "And how do you propose I do that?" Baelish smiled. "There is one thing Robert loves more than anything: war. Give him a war, and he will. Forget all else." Ned frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Baelish leaned in. "There are whispers in the south. The Dornish are restless. If they believe the Queen is being mistreated, if they believe this is all a ploy to weaken the kingdom, they will rise. And if they rise, Robert will have no choice but to turn his attention elsewhere." Ned clenched his jaw. "You would use a war to distract him?" Baelish shrugged. "I would use whatever works. The question is, will you?" Ned stared at him, heart pounding. It was a dangerous plan, reckless, but Lyanna's life was at stake, and in King's Landing, honor was a fragile thing. He had to act before it was too late. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon stood on the edge of a decision he never wanted to make. He had loved Lyanna. He had built his life around the idea of her, and now that love had soured into something ugly. He wanted to believe she was innocent, but the whispers did not stop. She had never loved him. She had tried to flee. She carried another man's child. He drank heavily, his mind clouded by doubt and wine, And then one night, Tywin Lannister came to him with a solution. "A queen accused of treason cannot remain on the throne," Tywin said. "The realm will not accept it." Robert rubbed his temples. "I will not kill her." Tywin inclined his head. "Then do not. Send her away. Strip her of her title. Send her to a distant keep where she will be forgotten." Robert hesitated. "She will not suffer," Tywin continued, "but she will no longer be your problem." Robert stared at the flames in the hearth, his mind a storm of pain and uncertainty. He did not want to do this, but he could not bear to see her look at him with anything other than love. And so, with a heavy heart, he made his choice. But Lyanna Stark was no damsel waiting to be cast aside. As the Lannisters prepared to move against her, she was preparing too. She would not be taken. She would not be forgotten. The wolf was ready to fight. The night was heavy with tension. The Red Keep, always filled with whispers, now seemed to hold its breath. Lyanna sat in the darkness of her chambers, listening. She knew what was coming. The Lannisters would not let her remain queen. They would not let her leave with honor. And Robert would let them do it. Her hands curled into fists. No, she would not go quietly. A soft knock at the door made her turn. For a moment, fear gripped her, but when the door cracked open, she saw him. Ned. Her brother stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. "We don't have much time." Lyanna rose to her feet, her heart pounding. "What is happening?" "They mean to remove you," he said. "Robert has given in to the Lannisters. They will send you away. Exile, if you're lucky." Her stomach twisted. "And if I'm not lucky?" Ned hesitated. That was enough of an answer. She swallowed hard. "What do we do? We leave? Tonight?" Her breath caught. "How?" Ned's face was grim. "I have men. Loyal men. We will get you out of the Red Keep and onto a ship before dawn, but we have to move now." Lyanna nodded, steeling herself. She had spent too long trapped, waiting for Robert, waiting for her fate to be decided by men who did not see her as a person. Not anymore. She gathered her cloak, tying it tightly around her shoulders. "Let's go." The halls were eerily quiet. Ned led the way, his hand hovering over the hilt of his sword as they moved through the corridors. The Lannister guards would be stationed at the main exits, but Ned had planned a different route, through the servants' passages, down into the dungeons, and out through the hidden tunnels beneath the keep. If they were careful, they would be gone before anyone noticed. But King's Landing had never been kind to Starks. They reached the lower levels when a voice rang out. "Halt!" A dozen torches flared to life. Soldiers blocked the passage ahead. More appeared behind them, and at the center of it all stood Jaime Lannister, his golden armor gleaming in the firelight. Ned's hand went to his sword. Jaime smirked. "Going somewhere, Stark?" Lyanna's heart pounded. They were trapped. Ned stepped forward, his voice cold. "Let us pass." Jaime tilted his head. "That's not how this works." Lyanna's nails dug into her palms. She could see it in his eyes. Amusement, yes, but also something else. A calculation, a decision not yet made. She took a step forward, ignoring Ned's warning glance. "You don't want to do this," she said. Jaime raised an eyebrow. "Don't I? You know what Tywin wants," she said. "You know what Robert has become." Something flickered in Jaime's expression. Then a voice echoed down the hall. "Enough, Robert!" The guard stepped aside, and the king himself strode into view. He looked worse than Lyanna had ever seen him, his eyes bloodshot, his stance unsteady. The scent of wine clung to him, but there was something else in his gaze, something final. He stopped a few feet from her, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You were going to leave." Lyanna lifted her chin. "You gave me no choice," Robert exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Damn you, Lyanna. Damn yourself," she shot back. "You let them do this to me." Silence stretched between them. Then Robert closed his eyes as if in pain. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "You cannot stay here." Her breath hitched. "You will be taken to Storm's End," he continued. "You will live there, under guard. You will have what you need, but you will no longer be queen." A chill ran through her. Exile. Robert looked away. It is better than the alternative. She felt the walls closing in. This was it, her fate, decided without her. Again. Her hands trembled, but she refused to let them see her break. She turned to Ned. He was watching Robert with a storm in his eyes, his hand still gripping his sword. He would fight if she asked him to. He would die here for her. She would not let that happen. Slowly she turned back to Robert. "And if I refuse," Robert hesitated, "then Tywin will have his way." A death sentence. Her heart pounded. This was the end. Unless, she met Robert's gaze, searching for the man she once thought he could be. And then, very quietly, she said, "Let me go." Robert frowned. "Let me go," she repeated. "No exile, no guards, no prison. Let me return to Winterfell, to my family. If you ever loved me, Robert, give me this." His face twisted, emotions warring in his eyes. Behind him, Tywin Lannister stepped forward. "That is not an option." But Robert was not Tywin's puppet. He looked at her for a long moment, then finally he spoke. "So be it." Tywin's eyes darkened. "Your Grace," Robert cut him off. "She will go north." His voice was hoarse but firm. "And no one will stop her." Lyanna's breath caught. Robert turned away, his hands clenched into fists. "Take her," he muttered, "before I change my mind." Ned wasted no time. He grabbed Lyanna's arm, pulling her past the stunned guards. They moved quickly out of the Red Keep into the cold night air. And for the first time in a long time, Lyanna Stark was free. The cold northern wind bit at Lyanna's face as she rode through the gates of Winterfell. After months trapped in the suffocating halls of the Red Keep, she had forgotten what true cold felt like.